Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video for History Valley Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor John Kloppenborg, and today we're going to be discussing Luke's geography and what the problems with his geography are. So welcome back to the show, John.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be here.
Good to have you back. So what exactly does Luke screw up with his geography?
Well, I'd begin by saying that when I look at any document and ask what the author knows about geography, and I think we'll see that Luke doesn't know very much about the interior of Palestine, but knows quite a bit about other parts of the Mediterranean. But I want to start by distinguishing three kinds of geographical knowledge or topographical knowledge that we all have. In the first place, there's what I would call a kind of general knowledge that we all have, your listeners have. I know sort of where Afghanistan is, and I know that Kabul is a city in Afghanistan, but I have no idea about what is next door to Kabul, whether you can see the mountains from Kabul, and so forth. So that's a kind of very general sort of knowledge. And many of your listeners, I'm sure, would say that they have general knowledge of, let's say, Boulder, Colorado, but they don't really know anything about it. The second kind of knowledge I would call cartographic knowledge. That is where you understand the specific relationships between between cities or between towns and so forth. I've lived in England for a little bit, and so I've got cartographic knowledge of London and Oxford and Cambridge and Sheffield, Edinburgh, and so forth. It's not that I have very detailed knowledge of them, but I can probably locate them on a map, and I know that Edinburgh is a long ways from London and Cambridge is not. But then there's what I would call local knowledge. And we all have local knowledge of the places in which we live. I would use the example, because I've lived in Jerusalem for 3 years, I've got pretty detailed knowledge of certain aspects of Jerusalem. I know, for example, that if you go through Jaffa Gate, you actually are in a long descent down to Al Wad Street, and then you turn right and you get over to the Western Wall. So there's all sorts of details of the topography of the old city of Jerusalem that I know pretty well, simply because I lived there. So when we ask about a document like Luke Acts, I think we can ask the question, what kind of topographical or geographical knowledge does Luke have? And it turns out that it's a mixture of local knowledge that he has in some places, cartographic knowledge where he has in other places, and only a very general and pretty mixed up kind of knowledge that he has, especially for the interior of Palestine. So there's a number of interesting features. To start with the interior of Palestine, Luke knows a lot of names. I mean, he knows the names of Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin, and Nain, and a number of other places. But if you look carefully at where those occur in Luke's gospel relative to where he puts Jesus in the gospel, it's pretty clear that he doesn't have any good idea of the locations of those sites. A good example would be in chapter 10, 13 to 15, Jesus is castigating the three Galilean villages, he calls them cities, which they most assuredly are not, of those three cities who haven't been receptive. But if you look at the narrative of Luke is placing Jesus not near those cities, but actually far to the south. So in chapter 9 of Luke, that is already in chapter 9, the Lucan Jesus is starting to head south from the Galilee into the region of Samaria and towards Jerusalem. So it's a little bit strange that he's chiding 3 Galilean cities that are already 40 to 60 kilometers to the north of him. That, I think, is a pretty good indication that he really doesn't know where those places are. He's got the names, and he's got the names from sources, but he doesn't have any good idea of where those places actually are. Another feature is that Luke has a really strong tendency to call places cities. So Nazareth is supposedly a city, and Bethsaida and Chorazin are cities. They clearly are not cities. There are meaningful definitions in the ancient world about what a city is, and there's really only 2 cities in the Galilee, and that's Tiberias and Sepphoris, and then cities on the Levantine coast, Caesarea, and then much larger cities like Antioch and Alexandria. But Chorazin and Bethsaida and Nazareth are villages by any reasonable estimation. So that's, I think, another indication that Luke really doesn't have much of an idea of where those places are or how big they are. He just sort of promiscuously calls them cities. Now, it's really interesting that when Luke gets to the coast, the Levantine coast, and this is at the beginning of Acts, all of a sudden he does know. He knows not particulars, and there's the map of the Levantine coast. He doesn't know very much about Caesarea or Joppa, but what he does actually seem to know is that there are 2 routes, a coastal route and an inland route. And so in Acts, Cornelius's slaves come down from Caesarea to Joppa, and they apparently can travel in 1 day. Now, that is actually possible along the coastal route. It's very sandy and marshy, but you can do it. But when a little bit later on in Acts, Peter and his entourage go from Joppa all the way up to Caesarea, finally to meet Cornelius, takes them 3 days to go. That suggests that they're taking the inland route, and it takes about 3 days to get there. So this is a very interesting clue that Luke actually has some kind of understanding of the relative distances between one site and another. And then he'll have Paul have the disciples, and later Paul, moving farther up the Levantine coast and eventually to the northeastern part of the Aegean. And when Luke's narrative gets to the northeastern Aegean, that is around Philippi, he shows real deep, not just cartographic knowledge, not just the abstract relationship between one site and another, but he understands, for example, that when you go to Philippi, there isn't a synagogue in Philippi, but there is a gathering outside of the city where Judeans meet on the river. That's the kind of knowledge that you get from being there. So the interesting problem that I've worked on is how we understand this strange combination of Luke's knowledge of the interior of Palestine, which is just about zero. That is, he doesn't have any firm grasp at all of where things are, or even the relationship of one to another. When he hits the Levantine coast, Joppa and Lydda and Apollinaris and Caesarea Maritima and so forth, he does seem to know the relative position of those places. And then when he gets up into the northeast Aegean, he seems like he has something like local knowledge. That might suggest to us that that's where he's from, or where the gospel is written from, or Acts is written from, or at least it might suggest that he has some kind of firsthand knowledge of those areas that he's picked up from actually living there. So that's the kind of problem that I'm working on, and then the challenge then is to understand what his possible sources of knowledge are, such that he is badly informed about the interior of Palestine. He's better informed about the Levantine coast, and he's well informed when he gets up to other parts of the Mediterranean. You're showing some pictures now of maps. There's at least two different kinds of sources of topographical or geographical knowledge that we have from antiquity. We know that Augustus supposedly engaged in a complete survey of the Mediterranean. We don't have anything left of that, so we don't know what it produced. But we are told that a colleague of his, a certain Agrippa, who was married to Augustus's daughter, Julia, created a long rectangular map, which was displayed in Rome. And copies of that map were apparently erected in other cities of the empire. We don't have any remains of that map. We've just got some descriptions of it. But I'll say something a bit later about the Agrippa map later on. Another source of knowledge are what are called itineraria. That is, when an emperor or some other grandee went on a trip, what was often created for the emperor is a series of stopping stations, the cities where you might stop, and the distance between that city and the next city where you might stop. These are called itineraria, and we've got a few of those. We also have what you're showing right now is Claudius Ptolemaeus, who produced a geography in the mid to late 2nd century of the Common Era, contained 8,100 names of cities and rivers and mountains, along with latitudes and longitudes. That is, he was a mathematician, and so he'd worked out the exact spatial relationships among those places. And this would have allowed for the construction of a map. We don't have his map, but we've got maps that are based on his map. And what you're showing here is a later map created on the basis of Ptolemy's Cosmographia. And this is the Levantine coast. And you can see here that Joppa or Jaffa, Apollonia, Jamnia, Caesarea Maritima, and a number of other places, Emmaus, it's called Imanton here, and as well as Ascalon, are listed on this map. So these are all sites that show up in Luke, that is in Acts. And by looking at the map, you can also pretty easily figure out what the relative distances between those maps are. One of the virtues of Ptolemy's map is, as I said, because it was based on a mathematical or geographical grid of longitude and latitudes, it produced, or it potentially produced, a relatively accurate kind of map. Another much later map, and I think you've got it. If the next slide is a list of the itineraria. This is one of these lists of basically of stopping stations, and the column in the right, where in 32 in Roman numerals and 23, 30 and so forth, these are distance markers. So this itinerary allows the constructor of the itinerary and whoever goes on, follows that route, to know exactly how many miles, how many Roman miles it takes to go from Byblos to Baryta and then to Sidon and to Tyre and so forth. So it gives you exact topographical distances between one site and another. A third kind of map, probably a successor to Ptolemy's map, is a very famous map called the Tabula Peutingeriana. Now, the version that we have, that's in the next slide, it's a map of everything from Spain to Babylon and everything from North Africa and to Britain. But it's kind of curiously crunched into not exactly, well, the north-south distance is crunched and the east-west distances are elaborated. So in that map, Italy kind of lies on its side instead of going down at an angle into the Mediterranean. This, on the next slide, figure 4, you've got a slide of the Tabula Peutingeriana. And if you look carefully, you can see that along the top, so you have the island of Rhodes sitting right above Apollinaris and near to Ptolemais. That's, of course, not where Rhodes is, but that's how the map maker depicted this. But what this shows, if you click on the map again, you can see two biblical sites are named. That is the Jordan River, and they're written in red, and Jerusalem, which is also written in red. This map maker from the 13th century was interested, clearly a Christian, was interested in indicating important Christian sites, but not all sites in the gospel. In fact, most of the sites that we have in the Gospel of Luke aren't on that map at all. The only ones that the map maker thought was worthwhile pointing out is the Jordan River and Jerusalem. But there are indications on this map of all of the cities that Luke mentions at the beginning of Acts as Peter and his colleagues move along move up the Palestine from Emmaus to Ptolemais and Tyre and Sidon. So every single one of the locations that are found in the beginning of Luke Acts are found here on the Tabula Peutingeriana. Now, it's a late, the version that we have is relatively late. It's the tabula can be dated to sometime just before 1265. So how relevant is that to our understanding of ancient maps? Well, it turns out to be relevant in interesting ways. And that's because of both some of the items that are on the map and some of the names of places on the map. So the map indicates that Dacia was a province. Now, the problem is that Dacia did not become a province of the Roman Empire until the 270s, when it was annexed. I'm sorry, the beginning of the 2nd century, when it was annexed by Trajan, and then it was abandoned as a province by 270. The fact that it's on the map as a province suggests that at least part of the map goes back to sometime in the 3rd century, when Dacia was actually a province. Constantinople is prominently on the map right now, and Constantinople as a center of the empire it doesn't exist until 324. So that part of the map, at least, is late, but other parts are early. What is really interesting is that the tabula lists as sites a number of towns and locations which in the 4th century didn't have the names that the tabula gives them. So, for example, the tabula lists Abeto Gabri, which we know was renamed in the late 3rd century as Eleutheropolis, the city of freedom. And yet it uses the old pre-3rd century name. The town of what we call Emmaus is called Amavente, but in 221 it's renamed as Nicopolis, the city of victory. So the tabula still contains very early names that even by the 4th century are not the names that are used anymore. What is really interesting is that when you go to the Italian section of the map, it names Oplantus, Herculaneum, and Pompeii. Now, until the 17th century, not only did those places not even exist, they weren't even visible. That is, they were covered over by volcanic ash after the eruption of Vesuvius in 79. The fact that the tabula lists those 3 cities, or these 3 towns, which no longer existed even in the 2nd century and were not even visible in the 2nd century, suggests that some parts of the Tabula Peutingeriana go back sometime into the 1st century where those places actually existed. Now, we can't tell how many of the sites that are listed on the tabula actually go back all the way to the 1st century. But it's a really fascinating map because you can start to detect that there's whole layers upon layers of topographical knowledge that have been built into this map. Now, what attracted me to this map is a very interesting fact that if you look at this is now already figure 6. 2 clicks on, that's Ptolemy's map, which lists the Lucan towns that we know from Acts. And the next one also is the Tabula Peutingeriana, where the sites that I've circled are all the sites that occur in Luke at the beginning of Acts. That is, these are the places visited by Peter and his colleagues. And so when the observation that I made about Luke, that when Luke gets to the Levantine coast, he actually understands the topographical relationship between one place and another. He knows that if you're in Joppa, if you take the land route, it's going to take you 3 days to get up to Caesarea Maritima. You know that because you've seen a map or you've seen something like that. And as you read through the first part of Acts and follow the sites that are actually named on the Tabula Peutingeriana or even on Ptolemy's map, you'll see that the author of Acts seems to understand pretty well what the physical relationship between those sites are. That's very different when Luke talks about the interior of Palestine, where, as I said, he seems to have no idea whatsoever about how one site is related to another. So at least one suggestion is that Luke, even though he doesn't have local knowledge of these places, that is, he can't tell you much except that it takes 3 days to get from Joppa to Caesarea Maritima. He can't tell you much about Joppa itself or about Caesarea Maritima, but he can tell you something about the relative distances between those places. And so because we know that some of these maps that had roads on them and it had distance markers between towns existed likely in Luke's day, at least by sometime early in the 2nd century. One wonders, I mean, I'm wondering out loud and suggesting out loud that Luke's topographical knowledge is informed by having a look at maps which were available in many cities in the empire because of the way in which Agrippa's map had been distributed. Interestingly, when we look at the Tabula Peutingeriana or Ptolemy's map, the cities of the interior of Palestine, none of them is there, with one exception. If you click to figure 7, we're back to Ptolemy's map. So you can see that Apollonia is there and Caesarea Maritima is there, Jamnia is there. That is, all these Levantine towns are there. The one city that Claudius Ptolemaeus's map has, which Luke also has, is Julius. But Luke uses the old archaic name Bethsaida for this place. By the time Ptolemy creates his map, he uses the new name for Bethsaida, which is Julius, named for the daughter of the emperor. So yes, Luke at least agrees with that one part of that one city of the interior of Palestine, but he uses a different name when he refers to it. So that would be and none of the other towns that Luke mentions, Chorazin, Capernaum, Bethsaida, Nain, and so forth, none of them are on Ptolemaeus's map, and none of them is on the Tabula Peutingeriana. So we've got, I think, at least part of the puzzle solved. The way we can account for the fact that Luke has decent topographical knowledge of the Levantine coast, but no knowledge whatsoever of the interior of Palestine, is that he's relying on a map like Ptolemaeus's map, or a predecessor of the Tabula Peutingeriana, that also paid no attention to those little towns on the interior of Palestine. And if Luke is using such a source of his geographical knowledge, it doesn't help him out when it comes to thinking about towns like Capernaum and Chorazin and even Bethsaida, because the name is not Julius. The name that he has is not Julius, but it's rather the older name, Bethsaida. So this was a kind of startling discovery for me, that one can coordinate Luke's level of knowledge and ignorance with what we know about at least a couple of important ancient maps that existed in the Mediterranean.
And what does Luke get right, and what does he get wrong when you compare those maps together?
Well, the interior of Palestine is almost completely wrong, or at least it's incoherent. So, when I teach Luke, I say to students that if you decide that you're going to go to Palestine or Israel for a trip of the Holy Land, don't bring the Gospel of Luke with you as a travel guide, because you're not going to get to where you wanted to go. What he gets right is the topographical relationship between towns on the Levantine coast, Caesarea Maritima, Joppa, which is now called Jaffa, and Lod, which is the ancient Lydda. He does get those right, and he's actually quite accurate. When you get up to the northeast part of the Aegean, as I said, when to around Philippi, maybe even north of from Ephesus and north of Ephesus, there his knowledge actually becomes quite deep, and he knows certain particularities of the geography and the climate. I think it was Robert Jewett in his Romans commentary, or somewhere else, I think it was in the Romans commentary, that he noted that that when Luke describes Paul's journey northward from Troas across past Samothrace and to land at Kavala, which is the port of that will take him to Philippi, he knows that actually is a journey that's going to take about 3 days of sailing. And that's because this is right around the Dardanelles, where the Black Sea empties through the Dardanelles into the top part of the Mediterranean. So you get an outflow of, you get a strong current that's moving from east to west into the Mediterranean. And also the prevailing winds tend to be northerly. So if you're going north, you're fighting the wind as you go up. And that's why it's going to take 3 days or so to get from Troas up to Kavala, and then to Philippi. When Paul comes down the other way, it takes him a day. And that's because he's not fighting the wind anymore. Now, that's the kind of local knowledge. That's the kind of knowledge that you would have if you've been there, or at least if you're depending on sources that have been there, knowing something about travel times and so forth. So that's where his knowledge actually becomes quite deep. I know that Richard Purvo, in his Acts commentary, wondered whether Acts was composed near Ephesus, because Acts has a lot of detail about Ephesus as well. That's also possible, and in that case, that would be an instance of local knowledge of Ephesus kind of leaking through into Luke's narrative in Acts 15. That's the kind of data that one looks for when you ask, when an author talks about a site, does the author actually know something about the site beyond its name, or beyond a kind of set of typicalities that, of course, a site might have? And in the case of Philippi, it seems that Luke has quite particular local knowledge, and in the case of Ephesus, he might have some particular local knowledge. That would at least invite a suspicion that he's writing from Ephesus, or he's writing from Philippi, or somewhere up there, and his deep knowledge of that site and its topography has leaked through into his narrative.
So what is happening in this slide?
This is a kind of general picture of what the Tabula Peutingeriana looks like. It's a slide of the part that deals with Gallia, with Gaul, and if you look up towards the right along the top, about a third of the way in from the right, you can see Parisi. That's Paris. I guess I'd have to say that if you decide to take a trip to Paris or Europe, I wouldn't use the Tabula Peutingeriana as a road map. It's got all these sites on it, but the topographical relationship of one to another is a bit strange, and that's because the whole map has been kind of stretched out along one plane and compressed along another. But the point here is that if you look at the entire Peutingeriana map and ask, what is it that you're being asked to see? This is a map that's something like 20 meters long. It's an enormously long thing in the Staatsbibliothek in Vienna. The answer is, you're being shown a picture of what I would call connectivity. Every single site on the map is connected to another site or several other sites by a series of roads. There are no unconnected sites at all on this map. And so as you look at it, what you're actually being shown as a viewer is a map of the interconnectedness of the entire world. That is the world of the map maker, which is this enormous area from Britain to Babylon and to Spain and to North Africa. That's actually, if you think about the maps that we have, we might think of maps as a kind of objective representation of space, but each map that we have is has a kind of ideology or a kind of backstory to tell the reader. And the backstory that this map tells is how everything in the European world, and Asian world, are ultimately connected. And there are two main sites to which they're all connected: Rome in the west and Constantinople in the east. So, each of those places is printed in much bigger print, with multiple roads ultimately connecting them to everything else. So this makes a statement about the importance of Rome and Constantinople in the 13th century, and the way in which everything in the world is ultimately connected to one of those sites. If you think about maps now that we see, our maps tend to connect sites of economic importance, sites of economic production, and airline hubs. That is, it's a map of how you as a traveler can easily travel from Toronto to Chicago, or from Chicago to Munich, or to Tokyo, or whatever. So it tends to be a map of large cities. Most maps are not going to show you villages. Most modern maps are not going to show you villages at all, because from the map maker's point of view, they're not important. What's important is economic movement, the movement of travelers, the movement where power sources are: Washington, D.C., London, Moscow, Tokyo, and so forth. So when we look at our map, we're looking also at a map that tells a story to us. It's a story about power, about money, about movement from one important place to another place, and it tends to filter out the unimportant places, like small villages. A medieval map is going to focus on villages. It's going to be a map of a whole series of networked villages connected to monasteries, to castles, because you pay your dues to castles, and the monasteries are important in your life, and a map of pilgrimage routes. When you go on as a pious medieval person, maybe once in your life, you're going to make a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or to some other pilgrimage site, to some local monastery or something like that. So the map then, that kind of map, becomes a map of what's important to villagers, to medieval peasants, what makes their life important, and the kind of sites that are worthwhile thinking about on those sites. So when we look at all of these maps, the Tabula, Ptolemaeus's map, our modern maps, you have to ask the question: what is the map maker telling you about what's important in the world? A contrasting map, this is the next slide, is a really interesting one called the Madaba map. It's a mosaic map found in the Transjordan at a place called Madaba. What I've circled on the map there is Jerusalem, and the next slide gives you a close-up of the Jerusalem in the Madaba map. Now, what's interesting here, and you see the yellow circles that I put around it, the map of Jerusalem is defined by this east-west white series of white stones. This is the Cardo. That's the main. It's a there's a north-south street called the Cardo Maximus. It existed from the time of Hadrian on, and you can still see parts of the Cardo in Jerusalem below the street level. It also lists to the left circle is the Damascus Gate. The right circle is the Nea Church, which was built in the 4th or 5th century, I forget which. And the other circles are the main gates of Jerusalem: the Jaffa Gate, Herod's Gate, the Lion's Gate, and so forth. So this is not exactly a map of Jerusalem to scale, but what it's a map that wants to put on it the important religious sites, the two major churches, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which you see in the large circle in the middle, and the Nea Church on the far right, and the rest of the map. If you zoom out a little bit to the next slide, you can still see the Jerusalem part of the map to the right. There's only one road listed on the map, and that's the road that runs from the Damascus Gate north to Neapolis, which is modern Shechem. But all of these little inscriptions are not so much town names, but places where important things in the Bible occurred. So just a little bit to the up and to the left of the white box that I've got is the place where Jacob had his fight with the angel, and so it goes with the other inscriptions. These are all references to things that occur in the Bible, and so instead of being a map of economic relationships or airports or even the network of roads from Constantinople or Rome to other places, this is a kind of map of the Holy Land and its relationship to religious realities, or it's a kind of map that connects earth with heaven, if I can put it that way, to the extent that these various sites that are listed on the map are sites where the divine has intervened in human affairs to reveal certain things, or to the case of Jacob, to have a fight between him and the angel and so forth. So this is a map like the other maps in the sense that this map has an ideological story to tell you, but this map is a map of the relationship between heaven and earth, or between Jerusalem and Christian believers who use the Bible. And so it's all of these maps do different things. This map, I should say, has nothing whatsoever to do with Luke's gospel. It's created after Luke's gospel. But it illustrates this interesting feature of maps and map making, that they are not exactly transparent or objective representations of topographical realities. They may be more or less accurate in some respects, but they're also telling a different story. And that actually then brings me to a kind of final point. When you come back to Luke and think about, Luke doesn't draw a map, but Luke gives you a kind of mental map as you read his story of first the travels of Peter and Stephen and others, and later the travels of Paul, as they move from one city to another. It's interesting that as you read Acts and look for villages, there aren't any. Paul seems to be able to travel from one city to another without moving through the intervening space. I mean, I'm speaking a bit facetiously here, but the point is that we don't get statements like, as Paul left the city in Antioch, he marveled at the mountains before he got to the next place. Luke is uninterested in the countryside when it comes to Acts. It's just city, 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 city. And in a way, Luke's representation of space is a little bit like that map that we haven't got an image of that Agrippa produced in the 1st century. It was a map of the Roman Empire and all of the places where Roman influence had been felt, either by a kind of expansion of Roman interests or by military conquests. So it was a map of our empire from Augustus's point of view. And we might think of the mental map that Luke creates in Acts as also a map of our empire, that is our Christian empire, that is the place where belief in Christ has now been exported and can be found. And Luke's map doesn't reach all the way to Spain, but we know from reading Romans that Paul was planning to go there. So you might think of the kind of mental map that Luke creates as a sort of counterpart to the Agrippa map of our empire. But it's also a map now of our empire, but it's a map of our Christian empire. Laura Nasrallah at Yale has written some interesting things on along a similar line of acts as a kind of counterpart to certain kinds of Roman political propaganda that asserted their ownership over the empire. And Luke might be doing something along the same lines.
So what caused him to think that Luke is somewhat aligned with political propaganda?
Well, aligned is maybe not quite the right word. That he knows about it. He knows about it simply because he lives in the Roman Empire, and he's the recipient of that kind of propaganda. But I think Nasrallah's point, and my point here, is also that Luke knows about that, but wants to create a kind of counter image, a counter map. So yes, the Romans dominate a very large area from the Levantine area all the way to Spain. But Luke's map, or the map that you see in Acts, is in a way parasitic on that map, but it's making a different point. This is not a map that's achieved by conquest, and it's not a map that follows tax extraction and all sorts of other mechanisms of empire. It's a map that comes by the Luke's version of the spreading of the gospel. So it sort of plays on the map that Luke can see laid out in the center of many cities, but it's a kind of alternate map, a kind of a para-map or a quasi-map that that knows about Roman propaganda, but wants to make something different of it.
Since Luke got so much wrong geographically, what do you think caused him to make those mistakes? If he was looking at existing maps in his time, why would he make mistakes off of maps that were more correct? What do you think happened?
Well, I think the point here is that the maps that we have of the Levantine coast from antiquity are accurate, and Luke's representation of the Levantine coast is accurate. That is, he's seen it. I think he's seen something like Ptolemy's map or a predecessor of the Peutingeriana map, and that's why he's accurate. The problem is that those ancient maps paid no attention whatsoever to the interior of Palestine. So what Luke has in terms of knowledge, source material, is Mark and Q, and they've got the names, but he doesn't know. He's got no way of locating those names in space. He's got if he had lived in Palestine, he would have a way of, he would know where these things are. But I think the fact that he's got things so wrong on the interior of Palestine first tells us that he's never been there. And he couldn't have used a map because none of the maps that we have paid any attention to the interior of Palestine. So a map wouldn't have been any help for him, even if he had seen, well, if he'd seen Ptolemy's map, it's not going to help him at all because none of those names are there. And that was the thing that I realized in looking at the maps, that every place where Luke has things incoherently placed, those sites do not appear on any of the maps. And everywhere where he has it right, those sites are on ancient maps. That's what led to this hunch that he's looking at a map, but when he comes to the interior of Palestine, he's on his own. He's got no way of knowing. Just as you and I, if we were given a list of towns in China, I would have not the faintest idea of where to put them on a Chinese map. Maybe you would, I don't know, but I wouldn't. But if you gave me a list of major cities in the U.S., I could at least put them more or less correctly, and you could probably do much better than I could. on a map. But that's because I've got cartographic knowledge of the U.S., or at least some of it. You do, and you've got local knowledge of all sorts of places in the U.S. But when it comes to cities in China, I think both of us would be hopeless. And that's, I think, how to think about Luke. He's got names from Q and Mark, but he's hopeless because he's not been there and he's got no maps to help him. When he gets to the Levantine coast, he's got a map to help him. And when he gets up to the northeastern, the Aegean, I think he's been there. And so at that point, his topographic knowledge becomes quite deep, as mine would be in Toronto and yours would be in various US cities where you live.
Does Luke copy any of the same mistakes that Mark made in his geography? And does he get it worse in other ways from Mark's mistakes?
I haven't checked that in detail, but my guess is yes, because Mark has a kind of strange topography as well. I do know that Matthew corrects Mark's topography. And that would suggest, I think, that Matthew knows enough about the geography of Palestine to be able to adjust things. But I've never checked what Luke does with Mark, at least as far as moving sites around. So, but my guess is that he probably either copies Mark's mistakes or even creates new mistakes.
What about the L document? Does that play a role in this at all? Luke's special source? Could he have gotten some of that information from that, or maybe other texts?
Well, there are some topographical references in that L material. That would be that's an interesting question. Is L more topographically accurate than Luke is? I don't know. That you raise a really good question, and that would be something to check out. I mean, it's certainly not beyond the realm of possibility that he's used sources that actually get things right, but because he's got no control on them, he messes up the topography. That would be a really interesting finding, if you could find accurate knowledge in some of his sources.
Later Christians become aware that Luke was making these mistakes, and did they try creating maps that imitated Luke but got Luke right instead? Did they do anything like that?
I don't think so, but what they did is they created itineraria, just as these second century and later itineraria did. So we have pilgrimage reports of Egregia and Egeria and a number of others who give you a report of where they were and what places they visited, and some details about, what I saw when I was in Capernaum and what I saw in such and such a place. Now, they get the topography right because they're actually giving you a description, sort of site-by-site description of where they went, sometimes how long it took them to get there, and what they saw when they got there. So they're not using Luke or Matthew or Mark. And they're certainly reading it, but I'm not aware that they ever say, well, Luke says it's here, and I don't think he's right. Well, for one thing, these pilgrims are probably far too pious to accuse the holy writers of mistakes. But they know the names of the sites from the Gospels, but they're on their own trip towards Jerusalem. There's also the Pilgrim of Bordeaux is another one who writes this travel log about explaining where he had been and what he had seen en route. But this is very much more like the Itineraria, where you get these pretty accurate descriptions of the relationship between one site and another, how many miles there are between them, what you see when you get there, and so forth.
Does the geography of Luke play a role in dating the document at all? Does the parts that he get right, does the parts of the geography that he gets right, does it seem to reflect or indicate when the text was written, or not really?
There would be only one place that I can think of where that might be true. And it comes from a different kind of argument that Steve Mason has mounted. Mason has made a very compelling argument that Luke knows Josephus' antiquities. He's got names of places, he's got names of rulers, and he's got other details, which he can almost only have gotten from reading the antiquities. And we know the antiquities were published in 93 and 94. So that would set an earliest possible date for the antiquities. The one bit of topographical knowledge that might be relevant is this. In Acts' story of Paul in Jerusalem when he is arrested, Luke says that he's on the platform of the temple, and he says that he notes that there is a staircase that goes from the platform of the temple upward to the Antonia fortress. Now, that's actually, if you think about the construction of temples in the Roman Empire, that's an unusual construction of a temple. Normally, a temple is placed at the highest place, the highest point in a city, and there's nothing above it. There's a kind of anthropological reason for that. Temples belong to the gods, and you don't want something even taller than the gods. But in the case of Jerusalem, the Antonia fortress is built on a little hill just to the north of the Temple Mount, and there was this descending staircase going down to the platform of the temple, and the tribune comes down that platform. Now, that's the one bit of sort of specialized topography of Jerusalem that Lucas got right, and it's an unusual thing to get right, but it's also a detail that Josephus mentions in Antiquities. So if Steve Mason is right, and I think he is, that Luke knows the Antiquities, then I would say Luke also has gotten that bit of knowledge about the peculiar architectural arrangement of the temple with this descending staircase to the platform. He's got that from Josephus, and he's worked it into the narrative. So when he imagines the relationship between Paul's arrest and the tribune, he betrays knowledge of Josephus. So that's the one point where it potentially has some impact on dating. There may be a few other places where you could say that Luke's knowledge of certain topographical features of the Mediterranean comes from a datable source like Josephus' Antiquities, but that would be the one that I would point to. Mason probably has got others that he could pull out of his hat.
And where can viewers go read more on Luke's geography?
Good question. There is, well, I did an essay that was published in a book called What Did Luke Really Know?, edited by Joseph Verheiden, Verheiden, and myself. There is an older essay by, who is it? I'm blanking on his name. An essay, I think, in about 1922 in Journal of Biblical Literature, if I'm not mistaken, on Luke's geographical knowledge or something like that. And the main point there was that when you look at the interior of Palestine, Luke's geographical knowledge is not very good, which is sort of the place where I start. Those are the two places that I think of. apart from revisiting this podcast.
Well, thank you for joining me today, John.
Thank you, Jacob. It's been fun as usual.
Yep. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.